The mahogany conference table stretched like an ocean between me and the 12 faces, staring in stunned silence. Their expensive suits, their perfectly styled hair, their practiced smiles, all frozen in disbelief. The same men who had dismissed my application without so much as a phone call 6 months ago, now sat before me, their new chief executive officer. The irony tasted sweeter than the champagne they'd been sipping moments before my entrance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I adjusted my blazer, the same navy one I'd worn to that humiliating rejection, and let my eyes sweep across each face. There was Marcus Wellington, the head of human resources, who had told his assistant I wasn't quite the cultural fit they were looking for. There was David Chen, the operations manager, who had laughed when my name came up in their monthly review meeting. And sitting at the far end, looking like he'd seen a ghost, was James Morrison, the interim CEO, who had personally ensured my resume never made it past the screening process. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. Finally, James cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. There must be some mistake. The board said they were bringing in someone with extensive corporate experience. I placed my leather portfolio on the table with deliberate precision, the sound echoing in the cavernous boardroom. My voice, when it came, was steady as steel. There's no mistake, gentlemen. I'm Alexandra Martinez, your new CEO. And yes, we have met before. The color drained from Marcus's face as recognition dawned. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. James gripped his coffee mug so tightly his knuckles went white. They remembered now. They remembered the woman they had deemed unworthy, the veteran they had written off, the candidate they had dismissed without a second thought. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, how a woman they refused to interview became the person who would now determine their futures, you need to know the journey that brought me here. It wasn't built in boardrooms or corner offices. It was forged in the deserts of Afghanistan, tempered in the crucible of rejection, and sharpened by every door that was slammed in my face. My story began long before I ever set foot in their gleaming corporate headquarters. It started in a small town called Riverside, where dreams were as scarce as opportunities, and where a girl named Alexandra Martinez learned that sometimes the only way out is through the fire. I grew up in a house where military service wasn't just respected, it was expected. My grandfather had served in Vietnam, my father in the Gulf War, and my older brother Miguel was already stationed in Germany when I graduated high school. The Martinez family had a tradition of serving our country, and I was proud to continue that legacy. But unlike the men in my family, I faced questions that had nothing to do with my qualifications or my desire to serve. "Are you sure you're cut out for this?" the recruiter asked when I walked into the office at 18. "It's not exactly what most young ladies have in mind for their future." I signed my name on the enlistment papers anyway, my hand steady despite the doubt in his voice. The United States Army didn't care about his reservations. They saw potential where he saw problems. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere that valued capability over assumptions. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was a baptism by fire. The drill sergeants didn't care that I was 5 feet 4 inches tall or that I weighed 120 pounds soaking wet. They cared about whether I could keep up, whether I could push through when every muscle in my body screamed for mercy, whether I could lead when leadership was needed. I learned to run faster than I ever thought possible, to shoot straighter than most of the men in my unit, and to think clearly under pressure that would have broken the person I used to be. When other recruits complained about the heat, the exhaustion, the relentless demands, I found strength I didn't know existed. Every push-up was a declaration that I belonged there. Every mile I ran was proof that they had underestimated me. My drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, pulled me aside after a particularly grueling exercise. "Martinez," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind, "you've got something most of these kids don't. You've got the fire. Don't let anyone tell you it's not enough." Those words carried me through the next 8 years of my military career. I specialized in logistics and supply chain management, skills that would prove invaluable in ways I couldn't imagine then. I learned to coordinate complex operations across multiple time zones, to manage resources under impossible constraints, to make critical decisions when failure wasn't an option. My first deployment to Afghanistan came when I was 21. The forward operating base was a collection of concrete barriers and prefabricated buildings in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The heat was suffocating during the day, the cold was bone-deep at night, and the constant threat of incoming mortars kept everyone on edge. But it was there, in that harsh and unforgiving environment, that I discovered what I was truly capable of. As a logistics coordinator, I was responsible for ensuring that critical supplies reached our combat outposts on time. Lives depended on my ability to navigate bureaucratic red tape, to work with local contractors who spoke little English, and to adapt when plans went sideways, which they did, frequently. There was one mission that changed everything for me. A remote outpost had been cut off for 3 days due to heavy fighting, and they were running critically low on medical supplies. The convoy route was too dangerous, and helicopter support was grounded due to weather. Command was ready to wait it out, but I knew those soldiers couldn't afford to wait. I proposed an alternative route through a valley that most considered too risky, working with local guides who knew paths that didn't appear on any military maps. It meant going against protocol, putting my career on the line, and taking responsibility for the safety of the entire convoy. Captain Williams, my commanding officer, studied the map I'd marked up with the proposed route. "This is your call, Martinez. If it goes wrong, it's on you. If it goes right, you might just save lives." The convoy made it through. The medical supplies reached the outpost in time to save 2 wounded soldiers who wouldn't have survived another day. When we returned to base, Captain Williams recommended me for a commendation. More importantly, word spread throughout the unit about the logistics coordinator who had found a way when there seemed to be no way. That reputation followed me through 3 more deployments and several promotions. I became known as someone who could solve impossible problems, who could see solutions where others saw only obstacles. By the time I made staff sergeant, I was managing supply chains for operations involving thousands of personnel across multiple bases. But it was during my final deployment that I learned the most valuable lesson of my military career. We had a new lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, who thought he knew better than the experienced non-commissioned officers. Lieutenant Bradley dismissed my recommendations about a supply route, insisting on a plan that looked good on paper but ignored the realities on the ground. The result was a disaster. A convoy was ambushed because it followed his route instead of the one I'd suggested. 3 soldiers were wounded, and millions of dollars in equipment was lost. In the aftermath, as investigations were conducted and blame was assigned, Lieutenant Bradley tried to shift responsibility to me. Staff Sergeant Martinez failed to communicate the risks adequately. Quote, he wrote in his report, "Her insubordinate attitude undermined the chain of command." The accusations stung, but they also taught.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Me something crucial about corporate politics and power dynamics that would serve me well in the civilian world. I learned that some people would always try to protect themselves by throwing others under the bus. I learned that having the right answer wasn't always enough. You had to be prepared to fight for it. Captain Williams, who had been promoted to major, intervened on my behalf. The investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing, and Lieutenant Bradley was quietly transferred to a different unit. But the experience left me with a deep understanding of how systems could be manipulated by those who cared more about their own advancement than about mission success. When my 8-year enlistment ended, I was offered the opportunity to re-enlist with a promotion to Sergeant First Class. It was tempting. The military had been my home, my family, my identity for nearly a decade. But I had other plans. I had been taking business courses online during my downtime, earning credits toward a degree in business administration. I had watched how military operations worked, how logistics and supply chains could make or break entire missions, and I believed those skills could translate into the corporate world. The transition to civilian life was harder than any deployment I'd experienced. After years of clear hierarchies, defined missions, and measurable objectives, the corporate world felt chaotic and unpredictable. The rules were unwritten, the objectives were often unclear, and success seemed to depend as much on who you knew as on what you could accomplish. I enrolled in a master's program in business administration, using my GI Bill benefits to attend state university. The other students were mostly in their 20s, fresh out of undergraduate programs, with no real-world experience but plenty of theoretical knowledge. I was 30, with 8 years of military service and deployment experience, but I often felt like I was speaking a different language. During group projects, when other students would spend hours debating theoretical frameworks, I would propose practical solutions based on what I'd seen work in actual high-pressure situations. When they talked about leadership in abstract terms, I could describe what it meant to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and limited resources. Professor Harrison, who taught strategic management, noticed the difference. "Ms. Martinez," he said after one particularly heated class discussion about crisis management, "you bring a perspective that's invaluable. These students are learning about leadership from textbooks. You've actually led." But not everyone appreciated that perspective. Some classmates seemed to resent my military background, as if my experience somehow gave me an unfair advantage. Others fetishized it, treating me like some kind of exotic specimen rather than a fellow student. I learned to navigate both reactions, finding allies among those who valued competence over credentials. My MBA thesis focused on supply chain optimization in high-stress environments, drawing on my military experience to propose new models for corporate logistics. Professor Harrison encouraged me to present my research at several academic conferences, where it was well received by industry professionals. One of those presentations caught the attention of Dr. David Chen, a former McKinsey consultant who had started her own management consulting firm. "Your insights about decision-making under pressure are exactly what our corporate clients need," she told me after my presentation. "Would you be interested in joining our team?" Working at Chen Strategic Consulting was my first real introduction to the corporate world, and it was both exhilarating and frustrating. The work itself was fascinating, analyzing complex business problems, developing strategic recommendations, implementing organizational changes. I thrived on the intellectual challenge and the opportunity to apply my military experience to civilian problems. But I quickly discovered that the corporate world had its own version of the old boys. Network. Client. Meetings where decisions were made on the golf course. Informal conversations in men's bathrooms where important information was shared. A culture that valued the right school ties and family connections as much as actual performance. Dr. Chen was an excellent mentor, but she was also one of the few women in senior positions in our industry. She taught me how to navigate the political landscape, how to build alliances, and how to present my ideas in ways that would be heard and respected. "You have to be twice as good to get half the credit," she told me during one of our mentoring sessions. "It's not fair, but it's reality. The question is whether you're going to let that reality define your limits, or whether you're going to use it as motivation to exceed everyone's expectations." I chose the latter. I worked longer hours than my colleagues, prepared more thoroughly for client presentations, and delivered results that spoke for themselves. Within 2 years, I was promoted to senior consultant, and within 4 years, I was leading my own client engagements. One of my most successful projects involved helping a struggling manufacturing company optimize their supply chain during a major economic downturn. The company was hemorrhaging money, laying off workers, and facing potential bankruptcy. Traditional consultants had recommended drastic cost-cutting measures that would have eliminated entire divisions. I proposed a different approach, drawing on my military experience with resource management under extreme constraints. Instead of simply cutting costs, I suggested reallocating resources to maximize efficiency and identify new revenue streams. The plan required short-term investments that made the board nervous, but the potential returns were substantial. The CEO, Robert Fernandez, was skeptical. "Ms. Martinez, your proposal is interesting, but it's also risky. If we're wrong, we could lose everything." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Mr. Fernandez, I've made decisions under fire when lives were on the line. I understand risk. But I also understand that sometimes the biggest risk is doing nothing." The plan worked. Within 18 months, the company had not only recovered, but was more profitable than it had been before the downturn. They retained all their employees and expanded into 2 new markets. The success story became a case study that Dr. Chen used to attract new clients. But even as my reputation grew, I faced constant reminders that I was still seen as an outsider in the corporate world. At industry conferences, I was often the only woman veteran in the room, and sometimes the only woman, period. Colleagues would introduce me as our military expert, as if that was my only area of competence. Clients would direct technical questions to my male colleagues, even when I was the lead consultant on their account. The most frustrating part was watching mediocre men get promoted ahead of me based on networking and politics rather than results. I watched colleagues who had never managed anything more complex than a college group project get fast-tracked into senior positions because they had the right connections or went to the right schools. After 5 years at Chen Strategic Consulting, I decided it was time to make a change. I had built a strong reputation, developed valuable skills, and accumulated enough savings to take some risks. I was ready to move into a corporate leadership role where I could implement the strategies I'd been recommending to others. That's when I learned about TechFlow Dynamics, a mid-sized technology company that specialized in enterprise software solutions. They were looking for a new vice president of operations, someone who could streamline their processes and position them for rapid growth. On paper, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to apply everything I'd learned about organizational efficiency and strategic planning. The company's website showcased their commitment to innovation, diversity, and excellence. Their mission statement talked about creating inclusive environments where talented individuals could thrive regardless of background. Their leadership page featured photos of a diverse team with impressive credentials from top universities and Fortune 500 companies. I spent weeks preparing my application, crafting a resume that highlighted my unique combination of military leadership experience and corporate consulting success. I included case studies from my most successful projects, recommendations from clients who had achieved dramatic improvements under my guidance, and academic credentials that demonstrated my commitment to continuous learning. The online application process was straightforward, but I decided to go the extra mile. I researched every member of their leadership team, studied their recent financial reports, and developed preliminary recommendations for operational improvements based on publicly available information. I included a brief strategic analysis as part of my cover letter, demonstrating how my approach could address some of the challenges they were facing. Then I waited. And waited. And waited. 2 weeks passed without any acknowledgement that my application had been received. I called the Human Resources Department and was told that all qualified candidates would be contacted within 10 business days. When that deadline passed, I called again and was told that the position was still under review. After a month of silence, I decided to leverage my professional network. Dr. Chen had connections throughout the industry, and she was happy to make some inquiries on my behalf. What she learned was both infuriating and all too familiar. They're not even looking at applications from candidates without traditional corporate backgrounds, she told me during a phone call that left me speechless. Apparently they're concerned about cultural fit and want someone who understands their corporate environment. Cultural fit. The same euphemism that had been used to exclude qualified candidates throughout corporate America for decades. It had nothing to do with qualifications or capabilities, and everything to do with maintaining an established order that favored certain types of people over others. I decided to take a more direct approach. I contacted Marcus Wellington, TechFlow's head of human resources, directly through LinkedIn. I sent a professional message highlighting my qualifications and expressing my continued interest in the position. His response was polite but dismissive. "Thank you for your interest in TechFlow Dynamics," he wrote. "While your background is certainly impressive, we're looking for candidates with more traditional corporate experience. I'm sure you'll find opportunities that are better suited to your unique skill set." Unique skill set. Another coded phrase that really meant, not what we're looking for. I had managed multi-million-dollar operations in combat zones, optimized supply chains for Fortune 500 companies, and led teams through complex organizational transformations. But apparently none of that constituted, quote, traditional corporate experience. The rejection stung, but it also clarified something important for me. Companies like TechFlow talked about diversity and inclusion, but when it came to actual hiring decisions, they defaulted to comfortable choices that reinforced existing power structures. They wanted innovation and fresh thinking, but only from people who looked and sounded like the people they already had. That's when I decided to stop asking for permission and start creating my own opportunities. If companies like TechFlow couldn't see my value, I would build something that would make my value impossible to ignore. I used my savings and took out a business loan to start Martinez Strategic Solutions, a consulting firm that specialized in operational efficiency for technology companies. My target market was precisely the kind of mid-sized firms that were struggling with the same challenges I had observed at TechFlow: rapid growth that outpaced their organizational capabilities, inefficient processes that wasted resources, and leadership teams that were too insular to see their own blind spots. The first year was brutal. I worked 18-hour days, marketing my services, developing client relationships, and delivering projects that exceeded expectations. I couldn't afford to hire employees, so I did everything myself: business development, project management, analysis, implementation, and follow-up. But gradually, word began to spread about the consultant who could deliver results that other firms couldn't match. My military background, which had been seen as a liability in the traditional corporate world, became a significant advantage in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Startup founders and growing companies valued the discipline, strategic thinking, and crisis management skills that I brought to their challenges. My breakthrough came with a client called DataBridge Systems, a software company that was struggling with massive operational inefficiencies. They had grown from 20 employees to 200 in less than 3 years, but their processes hadn't evolved with their size. Projects were delayed, costs were spiraling out of control, and employee morale was plummeting. The CEO, Jennifer Walsh, was a brilliant engineer who had built an innovative product but had no experience managing a large organization. "Alexandra," she said during our first meeting, "we're drowning in our own success. We have more business than we can handle, but we can't seem to deliver it profitably." I spent 2 weeks embedded with their teams, observing their workflows, analyzing their data, and identifying the bottlenecks that were constraining their growth. What I found was a company that had all the pieces of success but lacked the systems to coordinate them effectively. My recommendations were comprehensive but focused. I proposed new project management protocols based on military planning principles, restructured their communication flows to eliminate redundancy and confusion, and implemented metrics that would give leadership real-time visibility into operational performance. The transformation was dramatic. Within 6 months, DataBridge had reduced project delivery times by 40%, improved profit margins by 30%, and achieved employee satisfaction scores that were the highest in the company's history. Jennifer was so impressed that she asked me to join her board of advisors and referred me to other companies facing similar challenges. Over the next 3 years, Martinez Strategic Solutions grew from a one-person operation to a team of 15 consultants, serving clients across the technology sector. We developed a reputation for solving problems that other consulting firms couldn't touch, particularly in situations that required rapid decision-making under pressure. The success of my consulting firm opened doors that had been closed to me as an individual job candidate. I was invited to speak at industry conferences, serve on professional association boards, and advise venture capital firms on their portfolio companies. The same qualifications that had been dismissed as non-traditional were now seen as innovative and valuable. But the most satisfying validation came when I was recruited to serve on the board of directors for TechFlow Dynamics. The company that had refused to interview me 3 years earlier was now seeking my expertise to help guide their strategic direction. The irony wasn't lost on me when Marcus Wellington, the same HR director who had dismissed my qualifications, called to invite me to meet with their board. "Ms. Martinez," he said, apparently having forgotten our previous interaction, "we're looking for board members who can bring fresh perspectives to our strategic planning process. Your reputation in the industry is impressive." I accepted the board position partly because I was curious to see the company from the inside, but mostly because I knew it would position me for even greater opportunities. Board service was how corporate networks really functioned. The relationships formed in boardrooms led to executive opportunities, investment deals, and strategic partnerships. What I discovered at TechFlow confirmed everything I had suspected about their leadership challenges. The company had grown rapidly by acquiring smaller firms, but they had never successfully integrated those acquisitions into a coherent operational strategy. Each division operated independently, duplicating functions and competing for resources rather than collaborating toward common goals. The financial performance was declining, employee turnover was increasing, and customer satisfaction was suffering. The board was frustrated with the interim CEO's inability to address these fundamental issues, but they seemed paralyzed by the complexity of the challenges. During one particularly heated board meeting, I presented an analysis of the company's operational inefficiencies and a preliminary roadmap for addressing them. The recommendations drew heavily on my experience with organizational transformation, both in the military and in my consulting practice. Board Chairman William Patterson listened intently to my presentation. "Alexandra," he said when I finished, "this is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need. Have you ever considered moving from consulting into an executive role?" That conversation led to a series of private discussions about TechFlow's leadership needs. The board was ready to make a change, but they were struggling to find candidates who could navigate the complex challenges facing the company. They needed someone with operational expertise, strategic vision, and the ability to drive change in a resistant organization. 3 months later, I received a call from the executive search firm that was managing TechFlow's CEO search. They wanted to discuss an opportunity that they thought might interest me. I smiled as I listened to their description of the ideal candidate, someone with military leadership experience, proven success in organizational transformation, and deep knowledge of the technology sector. It was as if they had written the job description specifically for me, which, in a way, they had. My 3 years on the board had demonstrated my capabilities to the people who mattered most. When the board unanimously voted to offer me the CEO position, it felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun with that first rejection letter. Which brings us back to this moment, standing in the conference room where I had once been deemed unfit for consideration, now addressing the leadership team as their new chief executive. The silence that had greeted my introduction was finally broken by David Chen, the operations manager who had laughed at my initial application. "I have to ask," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "How exactly did this happen? The board didn't mention that you had previously applied for a position here." I smiled, the kind of smile that had served me well in negotiations with difficult clients and hostile board members. "They didn't ask," I said simply. "But since you're curious, let me tell you a story about what happens when you underestimate people based on their background rather than their capabilities." The next hour was one of the most satisfying of my professional career. I walked the leadership team through my qualifications, my track record, and my vision for the company's future. I explained how my military experience had prepared me for the kind of complex operational challenges they were facing. I outlined my consulting work with companies similar to TechFlow and the results I had achieved. Most importantly, I made it clear that I remembered every detail of how I had been treated during my initial application process, not as a threat but as a learning opportunity for all of us. "Gentlemen," I said as I concluded my remarks, "you're about to discover something that my military colleagues learned years ago. When you judge people by their potential rather than their pedigree, when you value capability over conformity, you get results that exceed your expectations." Marcus Wellington looked visibly uncomfortable. "Ms. Martinez, I want to apologize for any miscommunication during your previous application. We obviously didn't have complete information about your qualifications. I appreciated his attempt at damage control, but I wasn't interested in making this personal." "Marcus, this isn't about apologies, this is about learning from our mistakes and building a better organization going forward. We're going to create a company where decisions are made based on merit, not assumptions." The transformation of TechFlow dynamics over the following months was exactly what the board had hoped for, and exactly what the leadership team had feared. We restructured operations to eliminate redundancy, implemented new performance metrics that rewarded results over politics, and created advancement pathways that were based on demonstrated capability rather than networking. The changes weren't popular with everyone. Several senior managers who had thrived in the old system found themselves struggling in an environment that prioritized accountability and results. Some chose to leave, which was fine with me. I would rather have a smaller team of committed performers than a larger group of comfortable underachievers. But the results spoke for themselves. Within 6 months, we had improved operational efficiency by 35%, reduced costs by 20%, and increased customer satisfaction to the highest levels in the company's history. Employee engagement scores rose dramatically as people realized that their contributions would be recognized and rewarded fairly. The financial performance improvements were even more impressive. We exceeded revenue projections by 15% in my first quarter and by 25% in my second. Profit margins expanded as we eliminated waste and optimized resource allocation. The company's stock price, which had been stagnant for 2 years, increased by 40% in my first year as CEO. More importantly, we began attracting the kind of talent that had previously gone to our competitors. Word spread throughout the industry that TechFlow had become a company where merit mattered more than background, where diverse perspectives were valued, and where exceptional performance was rewarded. The recognition came from multiple directions. Industry publications wrote articles about our turnaround, highlighting the leadership approach that had transformed a struggling company into a high-performance organization. I was invited to speak at conferences about diversity in leadership, operational excellence, and the value of military experience in corporate settings. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Marcus Wellington, the same HR director who had initially dismissed my application, approached me after a company meeting 6 months into my tenure. "Alexandra," he said, his voice sincere, "I owe you an apology. Not just for how we handled your application, but for what I've learned about my own biases. Watching you lead this company has opened my eyes to how many qualified candidates we've probably overlooked over the years." That conversation led to a complete overhaul of our recruiting and hiring processes. We eliminated requirements that served as proxies for social class rather than indicators of capability. We redesigned our interview process to focus on problem-solving ability and leadership potential, rather than cultural similarity. We created partnerships with organizations that served veterans, first-generation college graduates, and other non-traditional candidates. The changes weren't just about fairness. They were about business performance. The diverse perspectives and experiences that our new hiring approach brought to the company generated innovations and insights that our previous homogeneous teams had missed. We developed products that served markets we had never considered, identified operational improvements that our traditional approaches had overlooked, and built client relationships that were deeper and more valuable than our previous transactional interactions. 2 years into my tenure as CEO, TechFlow Dynamics was acquired by a major technology conglomerate for 3 times the company's value when I had joined. The acquisition was a testament to the transformation we had achieved and the value we had created for shareholders, employees, and customers. During the acquisition announcement, Board Chairman William Patterson made a point of highlighting the journey we had traveled together. 2 years ago, TechFlow was a struggling company with declining performance and limited prospects. Today, we're being acquired as a strategic asset by one of the largest technology companies in the world. That transformation was possible because we learned to recognize and develop talent wherever we found it. The personal satisfaction of that moment was everything I had hoped it would be, but it was also a beginning rather than an ending. The acquisition provided me with the financial resources and industry connections to pursue even more ambitious goals. I used my proceeds from the sale to establish the Martinez Foundation, which provides scholarships and mentoring for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The foundation also partners with companies to redesign their hiring and promotion processes, helping them recognize and develop talent that might otherwise be overlooked. We've worked with more than 50 companies to eliminate bias from their recruiting processes, and we've seen dramatic improvements in both diversity and performance as a result. But perhaps the most important outcome of my journey from rejected applicant to successful CEO has been the message it sends to other veterans, women, and non-traditional candidates who face similar barriers. Success in the corporate world isn't about fitting into existing molds. It's about demonstrating value in ways that can't be ignored. Every time I speak at a veterans conference or a women's leadership event, I share the same message that carried me through the darkest moments of doubt and rejection. Your background is not a limitation. It's your competitive advantage. The experiences that make you different are exactly what organizations need to solve complex challenges and drive innovation. The skills you develop in the military, leadership under pressure, resource optimization, strategic thinking, team building, are directly applicable to corporate challenges. The discipline and resilience that military service requires are exactly what's needed to drive organizational change and deliver results in competitive environments. But perhaps most importantly, the perspective that comes from serving something larger than yourself brings a clarity of purpose that can transform entire organizations. When you've made decisions that affect people's lives and safety, when you've managed resources in life or death situations, when you've led teams through impossible challenges, corporate problems become manageable in ways that surprise people who haven't had those experiences. The story of my journey from rejected job applicant to CEO isn't unique. It's happening all around us as organizations begin to recognize the value of diverse backgrounds and non-traditional experiences. The question isn't whether change is coming. It's whether you'll be part of driving that change or part of being swept along by it. For the veterans who are reading this, know that your service has prepared you for leadership in ways that traditional corporate training cannot match. For the women who are facing barriers based on gender rather than capability, know that your persistence and excellence will eventually be recognized by organizations that value results over assumptions. And for the hiring managers and corporate leaders who are reading this, know that your next breakthrough hire might be someone whose resume doesn't look like everyone else's. The candidate who brings military discipline, diverse perspectives, and proven results under pressure might be exactly what your organization needs to reach the next level of performance. The conference room where this story began, where I faced the shocked expressions of men who had once dismissed me, has been renovated since TechFlow's acquisition, but I keep a photo of that moment on my desk as a reminder of how far we've all come and how much further we can go when we judge people by their potential rather than their pedigree. That's the real lesson of this story. Excellence doesn't come in just one package, and leadership doesn't have just one background. Sometimes the person you need most is the one who looks least like the person you expected. And sometimes, the best thing that can happen to your organization is being forced to reconsider your assumptions about who belongs in positions of power and influence. The future belongs to organizations that can recognize talent wherever they find it, develop potential regardless of its source, and create environments where the best ideas win regardless of who presents them. That future is already here, for those who are ready to embrace it. The question is whether you'll be part of building it or part of being transformed by it. The silence in my childhood home was different from the silence I would later encounter in corporate boardrooms. It wasn't the calculating quiet of executives weighing their words for maximum impact. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a family struggling to make ends meet while maintaining dignity in the face of circumstances beyond their control. My father, Carlos Martinez, worked double shifts at the automotive plant 40 miles outside Riverside. He would leave before dawn, his lunch pail rattling with the same ham sandwich and thermos of coffee my mother packed for him every day, and return after dark with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He never complained. Not once, but I could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. My mother Elena cleaned houses for the wealthy families who lived in the gated communities on the other side of town. She would ride 3 different buses to reach those pristine neighborhoods where lawns were manicured by professional landscapers and swimming pools sparkled in backyards larger than our entire property. She returned each evening with stories about kitchens with marble countertops and bathrooms with heated floors, told not with envy, but with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship and beauty, even when she couldn't afford them herself. Miguel, my older brother, had found his escape through academics. He was the golden child, the one who brought home report cards filled with perfect grades and teacher comments about his exceptional potential. The guidance counselor at our high school had helped him apply for scholarships, and when the acceptance letter arrived from the state university, our parents cried tears of joy and relief. Miguel would be the first in our family to graduate from college, the one who would break the cycle of manual labor and financial uncertainty. But scholarships only covered tuition and books. Room and board, transportation, and living expenses were still our family's responsibility. I watched my parents take on additional work to support Miguel's education. My father picked up weekend shifts despite his doctor's warnings about his blood pressure. My mother added 2 more houses to her cleaning schedule, leaving home even earlier and returning even later. I never resented Miguel for the sacrifices our parents made for his education. He was brilliant, ambitious, and determined to honor their investment in his future. But I also understood, even at 15, that there wouldn't be enough resources for 2 college educations. Our family could afford to send 1 child to university, and Miguel was the obvious choice. That realization might have been devastating for some teenagers, but it clarified something important for me. I would need to find my own path, one that didn't depend on my parents' already strained finances. The military recruitment poster in the high school guidance office caught my attention during my junior year, not because I had always dreamed of military service, but because it offered a practical solution to my financial limitations. "The Army will pay for your education," the recruiter explained when I visited his office. "Full tuition, books, housing allowance. You serve your country for a few years, and you come out with valuable experience and money for college." The practicality of the arrangement appealed to me, but there was something else that drew me to military service. In our house, work was respected above all else. My parents had built their lives on the principle that honest labor, performed with dedication and integrity, was the foundation of human dignity. The military represented the ultimate expression of that principle: service to something larger than yourself, with clear expectations and measurable results. My parents' reaction to my enlistment decision revealed the complexity of their hopes and fears for their children. My father nodded slowly when I explained my reasoning, his calloused hands folded on the kitchen table that had hosted countless family discussions about finances and future plans. "The military will teach you discipline," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the value of structure and purpose. "It will make you strong." My mother's response was more complicated. She worried about the dangers I might face, the possibility that her daughter might be sent to places where young people returned changed, or didn't return at all, but she also recognized the opportunity that military service represented. "You'll see the world," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "You'll learn things we could never teach you." The night before I left for basic training, my family gathered around the same kitchen table, where we had shared thousands of meals and countless conversations about dreams and limitations. Miguel was home from college for the summer, and he looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I could take out loans, work more hours. We could find another way." I appreciated his offer, but I knew it wasn't practical. Miguel was studying engineering, and his grades were good enough to qualify for graduate school. His future contributions to our family's financial stability would be significant, but only if he could focus on his studies without the distraction of overwhelming debt. "This is my choice," I told him, "and it's the right choice for me." Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was a shock to my system in ways I hadn't anticipated. The physical demands were intense, but I had expected that. What surprised me was how quickly I adapted to the structure and clarity of military life. After years of uncertainty about finances, education, and future opportunities, the Army provided clear objectives and definite pathways to advancement. My drill instructors were demanding but fair. They didn't care about my family's economic status or my lack of college education. They cared about whether I could meet the standards they set, whether I could push through discomfort and exhaustion to accomplish the mission. For the first time in my life, success was entirely within my control. The other recruits came from backgrounds as diverse as America itself. There were college graduates who couldn't find jobs in their chosen fields, high school dropouts seeking a second chance, immigrants pursuing citizenship through service, and small-town kids like me, who saw the military as their best opportunity for advancement. What united us wasn't our backgrounds, but our willingness to meet the challenges placed before us. Sarah Johnson, my bunkmate from Detroit, had grown up in circumstances that made my family's financial struggles seem manageable. Her mother was a single parent, working 2 minimum-wage jobs, and Sarah had dropped out of high school to help support her younger siblings. The Army had accepted her after she earned her GED, and she approached every training exercise with the fierce determination of someone who understood that failure meant returning to a life with limited options. "This is my shot," she told me during one of our rare moments of downtime. "I'm not going to waste it." Michael Chen had graduated from Stanford with a degree in computer science, but the tech industry had been unimpressed with his academic credentials, when they weren't accompanied by internship experience or family connections. I figured the Army would give me leadership experience and security clearance, he explained. Something to differentiate me from all the other computer science graduates. The diversity of backgrounds and motivations among my fellow recruits taught me something important about talent and potential. The recruit who struggled most with physical fitness turned out to be exceptional at strategic planning. The one who seemed least likely to handle stress became our most reliable team member during crisis simulations. The military had a way of revealing capabilities that might never surface in traditional educational or professional environments. My own strengths became apparent during logistics exercises. While other recruits focused on the physical challenges of moving equipment and personnel, I found myself naturally thinking about optimization and efficiency. How could we complete the mission faster? How could we use fewer resources without compromising effectiveness? How could we prepare for contingencies that might disrupt our original plans? Staff Sergeant Rodriguez noticed my aptitude during a particularly complex supply chain exercise. Martinez. She said after I had proposed a solution that reduced transport time by 30%, "You have a mind for systems thinking. Have you considered specializing in logistics?" That conversation changed the trajectory of my military career. Logistics wasn't the most glamorous specialty in the Army, but it was absolutely critical to mission success. Every combat operation, every humanitarian mission, every training exercise depended on the ability to move the right resources to the right place at the right time. It was a field that valued analytical thinking, attention to detail, and the ability to manage complex, interconnected systems. The advanced training for logistics specialists was intellectually demanding in ways that surprised me. We studied mathematics, operations research, international economics, and supply chain management. We learned to use sophisticated software systems for inventory management, transportation planning, and cost analysis. We practiced coordinating with civilian contractors, international partners, and other military branches. My instructors emphasized that logistics was both an art and a science. The science involved mathematical optimization, data analysis, and systematic planning. The art involved understanding human nature, anticipating problems before they occurred, and adapting quickly when circumstances changed. Success required both technical competence and intuitive judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who directed the logistics training program, became an unexpected mentor. She had served for 20 years, including multiple deployments in various leadership roles, and she understood the challenges facing women in military careers. During one of our individual counseling sessions, she shared insights that would prove invaluable throughout my service. "The military is changing," she told me. "When I started my career, women weren't allowed in combat roles, and we faced barriers that younger soldiers like you won't encounter. But some challenges remain. You'll need to be better prepared, more knowledgeable, and more professional than your male colleagues. It's not fair, but it's reality." Her advice wasn't discouraging, it was empowering. She was telling me that success was possible, but it would require exceptional preparation and performance. She was also telling me that my achievements would contribute to opening doors for the women who came after me. My first assignment after completing logistics training was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, supporting the 101st Airborne Division. The pace was intense, with training exercises that simulated combat conditions and real-world missions that required precise coordination across multiple time zones. I worked with transportation companies, supply battalions, and aviation units to ensure that personnel and equipment were positioned where they were needed. The responsibility was exhilarating and terrifying. A mistake in my calculations could leave soldiers without essential supplies. An error in my planning could delay critical missions. A failure in my coordination could result in equipment losses that cost millions of dollars. The pressure was constant, but it was also clarifying. Every decision mattered, and the consequences of those decisions were immediately apparent. My commanding officer, Major Robert Sullivan, had a reputation for demanding excellence from his subordinates. He had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he approached peacetime training with the same intensity he had brought to combat operations. During my first week at Fort Campbell, He called me into his office for what I assumed would be a routine introduction. "Specialist Martinez," he said, his desk covered with maps and operational reports. "I've read your training records, and I have high expectations for your performance here. Logistics is the backbone of everything we do. If you succeed, missions succeed. If you fail, people get hurt." That conversation established the tone for my time at Fort Campbell. Major Sullivan didn't believe in gradual learning curves or extended orientation periods. He assigned me to complex projects immediately, providing guidance when necessary but expecting me to figure out solutions independently. It was demanding, but it was also the most effective professional development I could have received. My first major project involved planning the logistics for a large-scale training exercise that would involve 3,000 soldiers, multiple aircraft, and coordination with civilian transportation companies. The exercise was designed to simulate the rapid deployment of forces to a crisis situation, which meant that timing and coordination were critical to success. I spent weeks analyzing transportation capacity, calculating fuel requirements, coordinating with air traffic control, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. The planning process required me to work with personnel from different branches of the military, civilian contractors with varying levels of cooperation, and international partners with different operating procedures. The exercise itself was a success, but the real learning came from the problems that arose despite careful planning. Weather delays forced last-minute changes to transportation schedules. Equipment failures required backup systems that we had prepared but hoped not to use. Communication problems between different units created coordination challenges that required real-time problem-solving. Major Sullivan's after-action review was both critical and encouraging. "Your planning was thorough," he told me. "But your ability to adapt when the plan broke down was even more impressive." That's what separates competent logistics officers from exceptional ones. That feedback reinforced something I was beginning to understand about military leadership. Technical competence was the foundation, but adaptability and judgment were what distinguished effective leaders from their peers. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to process information quickly, and to make decisions with incomplete data were skills that could be developed but couldn't be taught in classroom settings. My performance at Fort Campbell led to selection for deployment to Afghanistan, where I would face challenges that no amount of training could fully prepare me for. The transition from exercises and simulations to real-world operations where mistakes could have life-or-death consequences was both sobering and motivating. The flight to Afghanistan was my first time leaving the United States. As our military transport aircraft descended toward Boardroom airfield, I looked out the window at landscapes that seemed both alien and oddly familiar. The mountains reminded me of the terrain around Fort Campbell, but the colors were different. Browns and tans where I expected greens and grays. The forward operating bases scattered across the valley looked like the training facilities I knew, but smaller and more isolated. Boardroom Airfield was a small city populated by military personnel, civilian contractors, and local Afghan workers. The scale was impressive, thousands of people from dozens of countries working toward common objectives in an environment that was equal parts military base and international business center. My role would be to coordinate supply operations for forward operating bases throughout the region, ensuring that remote outposts received everything from ammunition to medical supplies to fresh food. The complexity of logistics in a combat zone was unlike anything I had experienced. Transportation routes were subject to security threats that could change hour by hour. Weather conditions affected air transport schedules. Local political situations influenced relationships with Afghan contractors. International partnerships required coordination across different time zones, languages, and operational procedures. Captain Jennifer Walsh, my immediate supervisor, had been deployed to Afghanistan twice before, and she understood the challenges facing newly arrived personnel. "The book solutions don't always work here," she explained during my first week. "You'll need to be creative, flexible, and willing to take calculated risks. The troops in the field depend on us, and they can't afford for us to be overly cautious." That philosophy was tested almost immediately when a remote outpost reported that they were running critically low on medical supplies. The scheduled resupply convoy had been delayed due to security concerns, and weather conditions prevented helicopter delivery. The outpost had sufficient ammunition and food, but they were treating casualties from a recent engagement and needed surgical supplies within 24 hours. The standard procedure would have been to wait for improved security conditions, or better weather. But Captain Walsh was right. The troops in the field couldn't afford for us to be overly cautious. I proposed an alternative delivery method that would use a smaller, more maneuverable aircraft flying a route that avoided the most dangerous areas. The plan required coordination with multiple agencies, approval from higher command levels, and precise timing to ensure that the aircraft could land and depart before security conditions deteriorated. It also required me to take personal responsibility for recommending a course of action that involved significant risks. Major David Harrison, the base commander, reviewed my proposal with the careful attention of someone who understood that decisions in combat zones could have far-reaching consequences. "This is a reasonable plan," he said after studying the route maps and security assessments. "But if something goes wrong, you'll need to explain why you recommended deviating from standard procedures." The mission succeeded. The medical supplies reached the outpost in time to treat wounded soldiers who might not have survived without immediate surgery. The aircraft returned safely, and the alternative delivery method was added to our operational playbook for similar situations. But the real value of the experience was the confidence it gave me in my ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. That confidence was tested repeatedly throughout my deployment. There was the time when a critical supply convoy was delayed by mechanical failures, and I had to coordinate emergency deliveries using civilian contractors who were unfamiliar with military procedures. There was the situation where communications equipment failures prevented normal coordination between bases, and I had to develop workaround procedures using backup systems and personal relationships. Perhaps the most challenging situation involved a disagreement with a senior officer who wanted to implement a supply chain modification that I believed would create unnecessary risks. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had recently arrived in theater, and he brought ideas about efficiency improvements that looked good on paper but ignored the realities of operating in Afghanistan. "We can reduce costs by consolidating shipments," he explained during a staff meeting. "Instead of multiple small deliveries, we'll use larger convoys that can carry more supplies with fewer security escorts." I understood the financial logic of his proposal, but I also understood the tactical implications. Larger convoys were more attractive targets for insurgent attacks. Fewer delivery schedules meant that bases would need to maintain larger stockpiles, requiring more storage space and increasing the consequences of any supply disruption. Most importantly, the consolidated approach reduced our flexibility to respond to changing security conditions. "Sir," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I appreciate the cost-saving potential of your proposal, but I'm concerned about the operational risks. Could we discuss some alternative approaches that might achieve similar efficiencies without compromising security?" His response revealed something about military politics that I would encounter again in corporate environments. "Sergeant Martinez, I appreciate your input, but I think you're being overly cautious. Sometimes we need to take calculated risks to achieve greater efficiency." The discussion that followed was professional but tense. I presented data about convoy security, storage limitations, and historical patterns of supply disruptions. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison countered with cost projections and efficiency metrics. Other staff members contributed their perspectives, but I could sense that some were reluctant to openly disagree with a senior officer. Captain Walsh supported my position, but she did so carefully. "Sir, Sergeant Martinez has been managing these supply routes for 8 months. Her insights about local conditions might be worth considering as we evaluate this proposal." The meeting ended without a final decision, but I knew that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was not pleased with my resistance to his ideas. Over the following days, I noticed that I was excluded from certain planning sessions, and that my recommendations were questioned more thoroughly than usual. It was my first real experience with the politics of disagreement in hierarchical organizations. The situation was resolved when an intelligence report confirmed that insurgent groups were indeed planning attacks on larger convoys. The information validated my concerns about the security implications of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's proposal, and the consolidation plan was quietly shelved. But the experience taught me important lessons about organizational dynamics that would prove valuable throughout my career. I learned that being right wasn't always enough to win an argument. I learned that challenging authority required careful preparation and strategic thinking. I learned that building relationships and credibility before disagreements arose was essential to being heard during conflicts. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for my convictions, even when it was uncomfortable, was part of my responsibility as a professional. The remainder of my deployment passed without major incidents, but with countless smaller challenges that continued to develop my skills and confidence. I coordinated supply operations for construction projects that improved living conditions for thousands of soldiers. I managed relationships with Afghan contractors who provided services that the military couldn't efficiently provide itself. I trained newly arrived personnel on procedures and systems that had evolved through months of trial and error. When my deployment ended, I had earned the respect of my colleagues and the commendation of my superiors. But more importantly, I had discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed. I had learned that I could remain calm in crisis situations, that I could solve complex problems under pressure, and that I could lead teams through difficult challenges. The transition back to the United States was more difficult than I had anticipated. After months of intense focus on missions with immediate life-or-death consequences, peacetime military activities felt less urgent and meaningful. The problems that had seemed important before my deployment now felt trivial in comparison to what I had experienced in Afghanistan. My family welcomed me home with a celebration that reflected their pride in my service and their relief at my safe return. Miguel had graduated from engineering school and found a job with a technology company in California. His success validated our parents' investment in his education and provided the financial stability that allowed them to reduce their work schedules slightly. But I struggled to readjust to the rhythm of family life and civilian concerns. My parents wanted to hear stories about Afghanistan, but I found it difficult to explain experiences that had no reference points in their lives. My friends from high school were pursuing career paths and personal relationships that seemed disconnected from my military experience. I felt like I was living in two different worlds without fully belonging to either. My commanding officer at Fort Campbell, Major Sullivan, recognized the signs of deployment readjustment that affected many returning soldiers. "Martinez," he said during one of our regular counseling sessions, "you've developed skills and experience that will serve you well throughout your career. But you need to find ways to apply those skills in peacetime that feel meaningful to you." That conversation led to my assignment as an instructor in the logistics training program, where I could share what I had learned in Afghanistan with soldiers preparing for their own deployments. Teaching forced me to organize my experiences into lessons that could be communicated to others, which helped me understand the value of what I had learned. My students were eager to hear about real-world applications of the concepts they were studying. They wanted to know how theoretical principles worked in practice, what problems arose that weren't covered in textbooks, and how to prepare for challenges that couldn't be anticipated. Teaching them helped me appreciate the depth of knowledge I had acquired and the unique perspective my experience provided. But teaching also made me aware of my own limitations. Many of my students had college degrees and technical backgrounds that surpassed my own. They asked questions that required me to research topics beyond my direct experience. They challenged assumptions I had developed based on my specific deployment, forcing me to think more broadly about logistics principles and applications. That realization led me to begin taking college courses during my off-duty hours, using my military education benefits to pursue a degree in business administration. The academic coursework provided theoretical frameworks for understanding the practical experience I had gained. Marketing classes helped me understand supply chain relationships from the customer perspective. Finance courses explained the cost implications of the decisions I had been making intuitively. Management theory gave me vocabulary for describing leadership challenges I had encountered. The combination of military experience and academic study created a foundation for understanding organizational behavior that would prove invaluable in my civilian career. I learned to see problems from multiple perspectives, to appreciate both the human and financial implications of operational decisions, and to communicate with people who had different backgrounds and priorities. My final assignment in the military was as a logistics coordinator for a joint training exercise involving American, British, and German forces. The exercise was designed to test our ability to coordinate complex operations across different military traditions, equipment systems, and operational procedures. My role was to ensure that supply chains functioned smoothly despite the challenges of international cooperation. The experience was both fascinating and frustrating. Each military had developed efficient systems for their own operations, but those systems weren't necessarily compatible with each other. Equipment that worked perfectly for American forces required different maintenance procedures when operated by British personnel. Communication protocols that were clear to German officers were confusing to American soldiers. Supply schedules that seemed logical to one military created problems for the others. Success required constant adaptation, creative problem-solving, and patient negotiation. I spent hours in meetings where officers from different countries explained their requirements, constraints, and preferences. I developed multiple backup plans for situations where international coordination failed. I learned to appreciate both the value and the difficulty of multinational cooperation. The exercise was ultimately successful, but it reinforced my understanding of organizational complexity and change management. I realized that the skills I had developed in the military, strategic thinking, problem-solving under pressure, cross-cultural communication, and team leadership, were applicable to challenges far beyond military logistics. As my 8-year enlistment neared its end, I faced a decision that would shape the next phase of my life. The Army offered me the opportunity to re-enlist with a promotion to Sergeant First Class and assignment to increasingly responsible positions. Military service had provided me with valuable experience, financial stability, and a clear sense of purpose. Continuing my career would lead to retirement benefits and the possibility of senior leadership roles. But I was also curious about how my skills might translate to civilian challenges. My college coursework had exposed me to business problems that seemed similar to military logistics challenges, but with different constraints and objectives. Corporate supply chains moved consumer goods instead of military equipment, but the fundamental principles of efficiency, coordination, and optimization were the same. The decision was complicated by my growing awareness of gender dynamics in both military and civilian career paths. I had been fortunate to serve under officers like Major Sullivan and Captain Walsh, who evaluated my performance based on results rather than assumptions about women's capabilities. But I had also encountered leaders like Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who seemed skeptical of my judgment and expertise. Corporate environments, from what I could observe, presented similar challenges. Women were underrepresented in senior leadership positions, particularly in operations and technology roles. But corporations also faced competitive pressures that might make them more willing to recognize talent regardless of its source. The business world might offer opportunities that were constrained by military hierarchy and tradition. My decision to leave the military was influenced by a conversation with Dr. David Chen, a former military officer who had transitioned to a successful consulting career. She visited Fort Campbell as part of a recruiting event for veterans, and her presentation about applying military skills to civilian challenges resonated with my own interests and ambitions. The corporate world needs people who can think strategically, solve problems under pressure, and lead teams through complex challenges, she explained. Military experience provides exactly those capabilities, but you need to learn how to translate that experience into language that civilian employers understand. Her advice was both encouraging and sobering. She explained that veteran hiring programs often focused on entry-level positions that didn't utilize the leadership and management experience that senior enlisted personnel had acquired. Breaking into positions that matched my actual capabilities would require strategic planning, networking, and persistence. The transition isn't easy, she admitted. But the veterans who succeed in corporate environments often outperform their peers because they bring discipline, strategic thinking, and leadership experience that can't be taught in business school. That conversation convinced me that civilian challenges might provide the intellectual stimulation and growth opportunities I was seeking. I began preparing for my transition by completing my business degree, researching corporate opportunities, and developing relationships with other veterans who had made successful transitions. The final months of my military service were both nostalgic and anticipatory. I was leaving an organization that had shaped my identity and provided some of the most meaningful experiences of my life. But I was also excited about the possibilities that lay ahead, the opportunity to apply my skills in new contexts and to test myself against different types of challenges. My farewell ceremony at Fort Campbell was attended by colleagues who had become friends, superiors who had become mentors, and students who had become peers. Major Sullivan presented me with a commendation that recognized my contributions to the logistics training program and my service in Afghanistan. But his personal comments meant more to me than the official recognition. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, "you've represented the best qualities of military service: dedication, competence, and integrity. You've also demonstrated that excellence has no gender boundaries. The civilian world is gaining a leader who will make a difference wherever she serves." Those words carried me through the uncertainty and challenges of the months that followed, when I discovered that translating military experience into civilian opportunity was more difficult than I had anticipated. But they also reminded me that leadership was about character and capability, not about fitting into predetermined categories or meeting traditional expectations. The skills I had developed in the military, the ability to analyze complex systems, to coordinate diverse teams, to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and to maintain focus under pressure, would prove invaluable in corporate environments. But first, I had to convince civilian employers that those skills were relevant to their challenges. That process of translation and demonstration would test everything I had learned about persistence, strategic thinking, and professional communication. It would also reveal new dimensions of bias and assumption that I had never encountered in military settings, but it would ultimately lead to opportunities that exceeded my expectations and vindicated my decision to pursue civilian challenges. The young woman who had enlisted to pay for college had become a leader with experience, skills, and confidence that could contribute to any organization willing to recognize her value. The question was whether corporate America was ready for the kind of leader the military had created. The transformation that followed my arrival as CEO at TechFlow Dynamics wasn't just about changing operational procedures or implementing new performance metrics. It was about fundamentally altering the culture of an organization that had grown comfortable with mediocrity disguised as tradition. My first executive team meeting revealed the depth of the challenges we faced. The conference room was filled with men who had built their careers on relationships rather than results, who spoke in corporate jargon that obscured rather than clarified their thinking, and who seemed more concerned with protecting their territories than advancing company objectives. Marcus Wellington attempted to set the tone by presenting what he called a, quote, comprehensive human resources strategy that was actually a collection of buzzwords and outdated practices wrapped in professional language. His presentation included slides about leveraging synergies, optimizing human capital, and, quote, driving cultural transformation without any specific metrics or measurable outcomes. "Marcus," I interrupted when he reached his seventh slide of vague concepts. "What are the actual numbers? How many qualified candidates are we rejecting? What's our retention rate for high performers? How long does our hiring process take compared to our competitors?" His uncomfortable silence told me everything I needed to know about the level of analytical rigor that had been driving our personnel decisions. We were making choices based on gut feelings and cultural assumptions rather than data and performance indicators. David Chen's operations report was equally revealing. He presented charts showing steady revenue growth and customer satisfaction scores that appeared acceptable on the surface. But when I asked about underlying trends, efficiency metrics, and competitive positioning, his answers revealed a company that was coasting on past success rather than preparing for future challenges. "David," I said, studying the spreadsheet he had distributed, "these numbers don't tell us anything about our operational effectiveness. Where are the productivity measurements? How do our processes compare to industry benchmarks? What's our actual cost per transaction?" The discussion that followed exposed systemic problems that went far beyond individual performance issues. Our company had developed elaborate procedures that prioritized process over results. We had multiple approval layers that slowed decision-making without improving quality. We had meetings to plan meetings without clear objectives or accountability for outcomes. James Morrison, the interim CEO who had blocked my original application, seemed particularly resistant to my questions about strategic direction. His presentation about market positioning and competitive strategy relied heavily on generalizations and assumptions that hadn't been tested against actual market data. "James," I said when he finished his overview, "your analysis suggests we're well positioned for continued growth, but I'm not seeing evidence to support that conclusion." What specific advantages do we have over our competitors? How are we measuring customer loyalty? What trends in our industry should be influencing our strategic planning? His response revealed something that would become a recurring theme in our transformation efforts. Alexandra, I think you might be overcomplicating things. We've been successful using our current approach, and dramatic changes could disrupt relationships we've spent years building. That attitude, the belief that past success guaranteed future results, and that change was inherently risky, had infected every level of the organization. Employees had learned to avoid taking initiative because innovation was viewed with suspicion. Managers had learned to focus on consensus building rather than decision-making, because decisive action was seen as potentially disruptive. My response was direct and unambiguous. Gentlemen, the market doesn't care about our comfort level with existing approaches. Our competitors are improving their efficiency, enhancing their customer experience, and developing new capabilities while we're protecting processes that may no longer serve us effectively. The weeks that followed tested every leadership skill I had developed during my military career. Implementing change in a resistant organization required the same strategic thinking, persistent communication, and disciplined execution that I had used to coordinate complex logistics operations in Afghanistan. I began by establishing clear performance metrics for every department and every leadership position. Instead of vague objectives like improve customer satisfaction, we implemented specific targets like reduce customer service response time to under 4 hours and achieve 95% on-time delivery for all orders. The resistance was immediate and predictable. Managers who had operated without meaningful oversight suddenly found themselves accountable for measurable results. Employees who had been comfortable with ambiguous expectations were required to demonstrate specific accomplishments. Systems that had evolved organically over years were analyzed for efficiency and effectiveness. Marcus Wellington was among the first to push back against the new accountability standards. Alexandra, he said during a private meeting in my Tayent office, these metrics might work in military environments, but corporate culture is more complex. We need to consider employee morale, work-life balance, and relationship dynamics. I appreciated his concerns, but I also recognized the underlying assumption that accountability and employee satisfaction were somehow incompatible. Marcus, my experience suggests that people are actually more satisfied when they understand exactly what's expected of them, and when their contributions are recognized based on objective criteria rather than subjective impressions. The data supported my position. Our employee engagement surveys, conducted for the first time in 3 years, revealed widespread frustration with unclear expectations, inconsistent feedback, and advancement decisions that seemed arbitrary. Employees wanted to succeed, but they weren't sure how success was defined or measured. Our customer satisfaction scores, which had appeared acceptable in David Chen's presentations, were actually declining when measured against industry standards and competitor performance. We were losing market share to companies that offered faster delivery, more responsive service, and more innovative solutions. The financial analysis was even more concerning. Our profit margins were shrinking due to operational inefficiencies that had been masked by overall revenue growth. We were spending more resources to achieve the same results, and our cost structure was becoming unsustainable in an increasingly competitive market. Armed with this data, I began implementing systematic changes that addressed both immediate performance issues and long-term strategic positioning. We streamlined our decision-making processes, eliminating approval layers that added time without adding value. We redesigned our project management systems to focus on deliverable outcomes rather than process compliance. Most importantly, we began recognizing and rewarding performance based on measurable contributions rather than political relationships. High-performing employees who had been overlooked under the previous system suddenly found their expertise valued and their opinions sought. Underperforming managers who had relied on relationships rather than results found themselves facing performance improvement plans with specific objectives and deadlines. The transformation wasn't universally popular. Several senior managers, including David Chen, chose to leave the company rather than adapt to the new performance standards. Some employees who had been comfortable with the previous system expressed concerns about increased pressure and higher expectations. But the results were undeniable. Within 6 months, we had reduced operational costs by 20%, while improving customer satisfaction scores by 30%. Project delivery times decreased by an average of 15 days, and employee retention rates for high performers increased significantly. The success attracted attention from industry analysts, competitors, and potential partners who had previously viewed TechFlow as a declining company with limited growth prospects. Our stock price began climbing for the first time in 2 years, and we started receiving acquisition inquiries from larger technology companies. The acquisition negotiations provided the ultimate validation of our transformation efforts. Representatives from Global Tech Solutions, one of the largest technology conglomerates in the world, conducted a thorough analysis of our operations, financial performance, and strategic positioning before making their offer. "Ms. Martinez," said Catherine Reynolds, Global Tech's Senior Vice President for Acquisitions, "we've evaluated dozens of potential acquisition targets, and TechFlow's improvement trajectory is exceptional. The operational efficiency you've achieved and the cultural transformation you've implemented represent exactly the kind of value creation we're seeking." The acquisition price reflected that assessment. Global Tech's offer was 3 times TechFlow's market value when I had joined as CEO, representing a return on investment that exceeded the board's most optimistic projections. But the financial success was only part of the story. The real accomplishment was demonstrating that organizations could improve dramatically when they focused on merit-based decision-making, objective performance measurement, and systematic process improvement. The lessons learned from TechFlow's transformation became the foundation for my next venture. Using the proceeds from the acquisition, I established Martinez Strategic Solutions with the mission of helping other companies achieve similar improvements in performance and culture. My first client was a manufacturing company that was struggling with declining productivity and increasing employee turnover. The symptoms were familiar: unclear expectations, inconsistent leadership, and decision-making processes that prioritized consensus over effectiveness. The solutions were equally familiar: objective performance metrics, streamlined decision-making, and recognition systems based on measurable contributions. The success with that client led to referrals from other companies facing similar challenges. Within 2 years, Martinez Strategic Solutions had grown to 15 consultants serving clients across multiple industries. Our reputation for delivering measurable improvements in operational efficiency and organizational culture attracted attention from venture capital firms, private equity companies, and corporate boards seeking independent expertise. The consulting work also provided opportunities to address the systemic barriers that had affected my own career transition. Many of our corporate clients had never seriously considered hiring veterans for senior positions, not because they doubted veteran capabilities, but because they didn't understand how military experience translated to civilian challenges. I began developing programs that helped companies recognize and develop veteran talent. We created assessment tools that identified the leadership and analytical skills that veterans brought to corporate environments. We designed orientation programs that helped veterans understand corporate culture while helping companies appreciate military perspectives. The impact extended beyond individual hiring decisions. Companies that successfully integrated veteran talent often experienced improvements in crisis management, strategic planning, and operational efficiency that reflected the training and experience that military service provided. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my post-TechFlow career was the opportunity to serve as a mentor for other veterans navigating corporate transitions. The challenges I had faced, cultural barriers, unconscious bias, and assumptions about non-traditional backgrounds, were being experienced by thousands of other veterans seeking to apply their skills in civilian environments. The mentoring relationships often began with practical advice about resume writing, networking strategies, and interview preparation, but they evolved into deeper conversations about leadership philosophy, career development, and the unique value that military experience could bring to corporate challenges. One of my mentees, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had been struggling to find opportunities that matched her experience managing complex logistics operations for international military coalitions. Despite her advanced degree and exceptional military record, corporate recruiters seemed unable to see past her non-traditional background. "Alexandra," she said during one of our monthly conversations, "I know I can contribute to these companies, but I can't seem to get them to see it. How do I convince them that my experience is relevant?" My advice was based on lessons learned from my own transition and observations from consulting work. Jennifer, you need to translate your experience into language that corporate executives understand. Instead of talking about military logistics, describe your experience managing complex supply chains under extreme time pressure. Instead of mentioning command responsibilities, highlight your experience leading diverse teams through challenging projects. 6 months later, Jennifer was hired as Director of Operations for a technology startup that was struggling with rapid growth and operational complexity. Her military experience proved invaluable in establishing systems and processes that enabled the company to scale effectively while maintaining quality and efficiency. Stories like Jennifer's reinforced my belief that the barriers facing veterans in corporate environments weren't insurmountable. They required strategic thinking, persistent effort, and willingness to educate potential employers about the value of military experience. But when those barriers were overcome, the results often exceeded everyone's expectations. The broader impact of these individual success stories was beginning to influence corporate hiring practices across multiple industries. Companies that had positive experiences with veteran employees began actively recruiting military talent. Professional associations started developing programs specifically designed to facilitate veteran transitions. Government agencies created initiatives to support veteran employment in private sector roles. My role in these developments wasn't as a policy advocate or program administrator, but as someone who could demonstrate through actual results that veteran talent represented a competitive advantage for organizations willing to recognize it. The success of TechFlow's transformation, the growth of Martinez Strategic Solutions, and the achievements of the veterans I had mentored provided concrete evidence that military experience translated effectively to corporate challenges. The journey from rejected job applicant to successful CEO had taught me that barriers based on assumptions rather than capabilities were ultimately unsustainable in competitive environments. Organizations that excluded qualified candidates based on non-traditional backgrounds were limiting their access to talent that could drive innovation and improvement. But change required more than good intentions or diversity initiatives. It required systematic efforts to identify bias in hiring and promotion processes, objective measurement of candidate capabilities, and willingness to challenge assumptions about what successful leaders looked like. The conference room where this story began, where I had faced the shocked expressions of executives who had once dismissed me, had become a symbol of the transformation that was possible when organizations prioritized performance over pedigree. The same principles that had enabled TechFlow's success were being applied by companies across the country, creating opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their backgrounds. The future belonged to organizations that could recognize and develop talent wherever they found it. The companies that understood this principle first would gain competitive advantages that their more traditional competitors would struggle to match. The question wasn't whether change was coming, it was whether leaders would drive that change or be transformed by it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.